Okay, to get us started here, one of the things you need to understand first and foremost is that routers are handheld tools. Okay, so they're a power tool used by electricity, and we actually use them by hand. Most of our routers are set up on tables, so just keep that in mind. That it is a handheld tool. That's a small one right there. This is a little bit bigger one. This is a plunge router. You would set it down and you would cut on it. Okay, what does a router do? Well, right here we have a small drawer, and this is that nice face of the drawer. And as you guys can see, you have this nice clean edge. If you go look in like your kitchen or your bathroom, you look at the cabinets that you have in there, you're gonna find that the edges of these boards, or excuse me, the edges of your cabinet doors have a nice finish like that. Even though it's at one point they probably were just perfectly square and flat like that. You wouldn't really necessarily want to have cabinets that look just like this. It's a lot cleaner, nicer edge when you do this. So routers can do this for you. The other thing routers do is they can cut grooves, so that when you put together a drawer like this, this bottom piece, you can cut a groove in this wood. Sorry, you can cut a groove right there that this will actually sit in. So they're very versatile. We have different bits that make different types of cuts. So you can have this finish. There's other finishes that it could be. There are numerous router bits that give you different types of finishes or have different types of purposes. So this video is not going to get into which types of router bits that we would use for different projects. What this video is going to do is just show you the basics of a router and how we use them in the shop. Okay, so this is one of our router tables right here. Just to give you a little breakdown of what you see. Remember I mentioned that it is a handheld tool that is actually mounted to the table. So that's what you see right down in there is where the cutting is going to occur. But if you come underneath the table, you can see there is the router. Okay, the router is just turned upside down. It is mounted to the table. You can see we have our electrical here, and this is where you would actually turn it on. Okay, so just keep this in mind that your routers, or excuse me, the router tables that we have in the shop are really just handheld routers that have been turned upside down and mounted to the table. Now, we can recognize that there's this fence here, very similar to like we've talked about with the miter saw. There's the fence on the table saw. So again, we have a fence. For the same purposes as we've had other fences, we use them to put our material up against, right? So as we are sliding this material through, we would push it up against the fence as we slide it along to make that nice straight cut. If we didn't have a fence here and we just tried to finagle it, you're going to end up with your cuts all over the place. So we have our fence. This is a guard to make sure that our hands never get anywhere near that blade, that spinning blade. So this goes through here just like this, and it makes that cut, goes through, and I can keep my hands away from that. It's clear so I can see through it, which is nice. And then it's hard to tell, but there's a piece back in there. This is called a feather board, and that's what it looks like behind there. What the feather board does is the feather board helps make sure that your wood does not lift as it goes through. So it would set on it and it would go through like that. What will often happen without a feather board is the board, when the board hits the bit on the router, it may want to lift on you, okay? And it may push it up. So keep in mind, there's a blade sticking up, right? There's a router bit sticking up, and you're moving the wood into that bit. So there's a possibility that it's going to want to lift. So that's what these feather boards do, is they prevent that lifting. Okay, and so you get that nice smooth motion right through that that router bit. So we have our feather boards, which is right here. We have this guard, which is for your protection for your fingers. We have our fence back in here. We have the adjustability to raise these guards or lower them depending on the size of the wood and what we're trying to do. Again, we have the miter gauge, right? We have a miter gauge out here again. So something to keep in mind, that you have these channels and these tables. That's what they're for. But on this particular setup, you could see here that the miter gauge is too wide because of this safety barrier here, the plastic guard. So you might not be able to use this particular miter gauge. We'd have to get a small one. We have a different one that's smaller. Or you could take the miter gauge out completely, and you could use a rabbet. Right, you could use the rabbet right here, and you could do it this way. If this was the board I was using, I would just be sliding my fingers through like this, keeping it away from it. And then if I was not comfortable, I could grab the rabbet and I could go like that. You could use a rabbet for the same reasons that we've used on other tools. The basic operation that you need to know of is that here is the router bit. It is spinning at a very high rate, and you are going to feed the wood into that. Which brings us to the most important question about a router. Which way do we feed the board? Would we come in from this side, or would we come in from this side? You always feed into the blades, okay? So just like the bandsaw, we feed into the blade. Just like the table saw, we're feeding into the blade. Well, with the router, we're gonna feed into the blade. The question is, which way is the blade spinning so I know? Well, on all of our table routers, all right, all of the routers that are set up on tables, you're gonna feed from the right side of the table to the left side of the table. In other words, that router bit is spinning counterclockwise. So it's spinning counterclockwise. If you're standing here looking at it, it is coming from your left and spinning back towards your right. Because it is spinning in that direction, you feed into that cut. If you were to feed it this way, it's gonna hit that board, it's gonna push it out at you. This particular table saw has the guard and it's telling you which way the rotation is. So you can actually see right here, it says rotation and there's an arrow. The other table saws we have in the shop are marked as well. So you don't have to be too afraid of, oh, I don't know which way to do it. You just have to look around. In fact, you can even see right here, it says rotation is this way. So just keep that in mind, that you know which way to feed it. Now let's talk about feeding. So this little piece of scrap wood that I just grabbed in order to show you, you have to make sure of two things. One, we want to make sure that we have it secured and pushed down against the table and then up against this fence. As we feed, we're going to keep that pressure down and keep that pressure against it, because what's going to happen is if you don't keep pressure down and against the fence, it'll move on you, and then it's going to make a bad cut over here. Especially when we're trying to make a nice, clean, finished edge, we want to make sure it's consistent. So the first thing we make sure of is that its pressure is pushed down and then it's pushed into it, right? Then we start to move right to left, okay? And as I get through it, right, I'm like this, I'm coming here, this hand just slides over, I get towards the end, I keep my fingers on the edge of it, and then I push all the way through right here and I'm done, okay? A lot of times what will happen is students will get to that cut, they'll hit it, and then they'll stop, and then they'll kind of move again, and what happens is it begins to mess up your cut. It's not nice and straight. It'll get a little crooked. The last thing that I want to talk about when we feed is that rate of speed. So we do not want to just go boom and push real fast, and we don't want to go super, super slow because we'll burn up the wood. So it's one of those things that you're just going to have to practice and get to using the tool, and you'll start to figure it out. But basically a steady speed. Even though the router's not on right now, it would pretty much look like this. I'd be cutting, and I'd be feeding it at about this kind of pace. This is about the pace that you would be using. You would listen, obviously, to the sound of the blade, the sound, of the bit, cutting, sliding, moving hands, and finishing all the way through. Okay, so we're gonna go ahead and get a demonstration on how this is used. I'm gonna turn the vacuum on so that a lot of the dust is getting sucked up so you can actually see. And yeah, I'll show you. This particular one, what we're doing is we're actually just cutting, the router bit that's set up is to cut a small dado groove. So it's basically just, imagine like a groove like this is what we're gonna be cutting into the wood right now. Okay, so you could see I had a pretty consistent speed as I fed it through. There was downward pressure, it was up against the fence, and then slid right to left. And then we went ahead and we got this fancy little groove in our wood here. And what that would be for is like putting in, say, like the bottom of if this were like a drawer, we would fit the bottom of the drawer with like a balsa wood or something like that. A lot of different reasons for something like this. But the most important thing that you saw was, one, downward pressure up against the fence, using that fence to keep it nice and square. If I didn't have the fence, then this line would not be as straight as it is. It is a very nice straight line. So it would be like that, right to left, and all the way through. Don't stop in the middle, don't back up. The feather board that's in there helps keep it secured down as you start to slide it from right to left. Okay, so that's gonna bring us to the end of our router video. But once again, before we leave for the day with this particular video, we wanna go over just kind of a basic checklist. One, do we have proper eye protection? Obviously I have my glasses right here. This particular machine, it cuts and it throws a lot of dust out, which is why we always want to make sure in our checklist that the vacuum is running when we're using our router, just like it needs to be running on a lot of other tools. So make sure that vacuum is running when we have the router. We would get everything set up. I have to come up, I need to check my depth. I need to make sure that the router setup is appropriate. If I'm making that dado cut like I did in the demonstration a moment ago, if I'm making one of those, I need to make sure that the depth is proper before I do anything. I want to make sure that where it's going to cut, how far up the wood, I do all of that beforehand. So I plan out those cuts, check the setup, make sure it's exactly what it needs to be before I begin that process. So again, we go checklist. I make sure that my wood is set up already. I've planned out all of that. I have my glasses on. I turn that vacuum on, and then I use an appropriate speed, putting pressure down on the board, up against the fence, and an appropriate speed feeding through the router bit as it cuts. The router is a bit that's spinning at an incredibly high rate of speed. So we have to be sure that we are all set up and not trying to make adjustments on the fly. We need to be in a good position to say, okay, I'm ready to go, and I just feed right through that router. So most of the router mistakes happen because people are not preparing for that particular cut. In other words, they're not setting up the wood appropriately, they're not setting up the router appropriately, they're just walking up, they're not thinking, and they just think, oh, I could just go and use the router, and it's not set up perfectly for them. So again, one of the biggest safety mechanisms of this particular tool is making sure that the setup is appropriate for what you're doing before you actually do it. All right, so that's gonna finish up our router video. Make sure you guys go and take that quiz, and we'll see you with the next video.